Welcome to the world of Aora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Welcome everybody to the world of Aora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. For those wondering why we pair Avowed and Pillars of Eternity together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Aora. And so the aim of this podcast is to just dive into a world that we know and love through these games, or just learn more about this world if it's something you found interesting. Perhaps you're a huge fan of Obsidian and their work, and this is just one way to appreciate that. Perhaps you also might want to bring some of these ideas to a table for a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons or what have you. Regardless of why you're here, very happy to have you here. If you're new to the show, welcome to the show. Really awesome to have you here with us. And I'm going to signpost you towards episode 0 if you want to learn where some episodes that are more foundational are about the lore of this world, such as how magic works, what the races are, a little bit about the gods, etc., etc. But you're more than welcome to start here. Today will be a beginner-friendly episode, and no spoilers that I can foresee in discussing things. Maybe perhaps a couple details in like side quests here or there, but nothing critical. We're going to be talking about the Knights of the Crucible today, which is a faction that we interact with in the first Pillars of Eternity game. They have a really important and long-standing history within the area of the Deerwood, which is the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. And there's a lot more to them than just people in armor who are the local militia for the area. There is a hierarchy. There's kind of like a self-government. They have some religious ties. They have history within the independence of the Deerwood itself. And there's a lot there that we can chew through if you wanted to learn more about the Knights of the Crucible. Before diving into the lore, I like to talk about any news if there is some. The only thing worth mentioning, I suppose, is that Pillars of Eternity 1 has had its turn-based mode, or at least I think the public beta for it has been out, and so people are able to try that now. And that's partly why I'm talking about this, because maybe I'll actually replay some of Pillars of Eternity 1 with that turn-based mode. Now, granted, I haven't really got into it that much, and Pillars of Eternity was actually my entry point into these kind of games. So despite the fact that I genuinely love turn-based mode in a lot of my games, I think I'm a real-time with pause guy when it comes to Pillars of Eternity, but that's just because that's what I cut my teeth on, so that's why I have it for that. I know there can be some strong opinion about it either way, but you know, if you like your games the way they are, then that's just how it goes. And hopefully turn-based mode ends up actually doing that in an honorable way, you know, like making it in a good way, because I want more people that can play Pillars, the better. And there's some people who just can't or don't or really dislike real-time with pause, and I don't blame you for not playing that if you don't like it. Why would you spend 120 hours playing a game where you don't like one of the main mechanics that's within the game? That totally makes sense, but regardless. Other than that, Obsidian has received some nominations for Best RPG at the Game Awards. Outer Worlds 2 and Avowed are both in the nominations. Whether or not they'll get them, I don't know. They got some pretty strong competition, especially with Clair Obscur being on that list as well. I think we're going to see another kind of Baldur's Gate 3 situation, except with Clair Obscur this year, but that's just my personal opinion. So yeah, there's that. We're still waiting on, at least at the time of this recording, for the final update for Avowed that will include New Game Plus as well as a brand new weapon, and I think some other perks, etc., where you can really do a brand new replay of the game. So I'm really looking forward to that, because it'll let me get into Avowed in a more novel way. I think at this point I've replayed Avowed. I fully have replayed Avowed, I think a few or several times, depending on how you define the word. And I've done like little kind of playthroughs or like little playthrough sections of the game. I have kind of lost count at this point in time. So I'll be looking forward to replaying the entire game in a more novel way with a new weapon set, maybe some new character creation model stuff as well, whatever they include in the game. Looking forward to trying all that out. But that all said, let's dive into today's lore.
Half the locals would arrest you for trespassing and the rest would kill you outright. I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
So a lot of today's episode is actually going to come from in-game books and conversations from Pillars of Eternity 1, and I'm going to be reading them off of the Pillars of Eternity fandom website once I can get all the ads off the screen. I don't know if anyone's known for a while just how ad-riddled the fandom websites are, but I mean, I get it. You got to pay for these services somehow. But regardless, so we're going to be reading through some books today. The first one we're going to start with is called The Blacksmith Knights, a short history of the Knights of the Crucible. This is an in-game book at Pillars of Eternity 1 that you can pick up and read, and it tells you all about the Knights of the Crucible. But before we dive into that, a quick little overview of who the Knights of the Crucible are, at least when you're playing the game of Pillars of Eternity. In Pillars of Eternity 1, there is a major city settlement that you go to in the game called Defiance Bay. This is it's not the only major settlement in the game. The first major settlement that you go to is actually Gilded Vale, which is more like a village. But in terms of like the major city settlement, Defiance Bay is the big one. It's got multiple districts within the city itself that you can explore, and it's at the seat or the center for a lot of the power and government of the Deerwood within its walls. And it's a really big point in the game. I would say this is where a lot of the gameplay drastically shifts depending on the type of gamer you are. I know for myself and many others that we're very completionist in exploring all that the Pillars of Eternity game had to offer. Once you get to Defiance Bay, you get quest after quest after quest, and you find yourself for multiple playthrough sessions just venturing around those walls, learning everything there is, talking to as many people as you can, and you're going to spend a lot of time in Defiance Bay. And I really enjoyed that. That's why Nekataka was one of my favorite things in the second Pillars of Eternity game. But in Defiance Bay, there are these three major factions within the city that you get to engage with. Well, there's actually more than that, but there's three that get mentioned primarily. One is a group called the Dozens, which I actually have done an episode about, and is this kind of like militant group of people that take inspiration from a group of dozen soldiers that stood against the god Aethys in the Saints' War, which I've talked about at length on previous episodes. And then there is the House of Dominel, which is kind of like a crime family syndicate within Defiance Bay, and they have their hands on all the seedy underbelly areas of Defiance Bay. And it's very clearly like the token rogue/bad guy route to take if you're going to align with one of these three factions as part of the critical path. And then there are the Knights of the Crucible, people who are honor-bound and have strict duty. They also have a classic hierarchy of superiors and inferiors, and they have a very military form, like mini government that they abide by. And they're all ironclad, or not ironclad, but they're all plate knighted, like they have they don plate armor, and they have a code that they live by, and they have a deep history in the Deerwood in working towards its independence and fighting for justice, etc., etc. These are one of the three factions that you're able to engage with as the player character in Pillars of Eternity 1 when you're looking for factions to ally with within the city of Defiance Bay. And it's one of your three options. And I've talked about the Dozens before. I've kind of touched on the House of Dominel a little bit, but today we're going to be talking about Knights of the Crucible. So let's start with a short history of the Knights of the Crucible to understand a little bit more about their origins and where they come from. This in-game book starts off with a quote by Olrun Sinehod, which was the first guildmaster of the Knights of the Crucible, and this slogan or quote goes like this: "If the blacksmith fails, the armor fails. If the armor fails, the soldier falls." And there's a lot of the ethos of the Knights of the Crucible that's summed up in that one statement. If the blacksmith fails, the armor fails. If the armor fails, the soldier falls. And I think it really touches on the breadth of things that they are really focusing on, that they're trying to get engaged and in-depth with. And that is blacksmithing and the forge, but also being a soldier. And that's what they're tied together. It's a very important aspect of being in the Knights of the Crucible is that you are a skilled blacksmith as well as a skilled soldier, and that you see those two worlds intertwining and really being one thing rather than just two separate things. So I'm going to read through this book, and I'll stop periodically to maybe explain some terms or stuff if you are new to all this, or just give some backstory and connect some dots here and there. But starting off, this book reads, The Knights of the Crucible have one of the most fascinating and rich histories in all of Eora. Currently holding a position as an incredibly influential group in the Deerwood, they come from humble beginnings. There may not be a single person in all the Deerwood who knows exactly how much they owe to the Knights. The group has existed for years, long before they even became known as the Knights. They started as a group of blacksmiths, led by Olrun Sinhud, who came together to form a guild. Olrun felt it imperative for the members to unify, sharing their knowledge through the guild in order to keep the skills and techniques they had spent their lives perfecting. He called the guild the Crucible, insisting that, though their work was used for destruction, they should always be remembered as creators. They would be known as the vessel that withstands the fire to deliver new form into the world, forged in the fire and all the stronger for the tribulation. Olrun, being a veteran of many battles, knew the importance of impeccably made armor and weaponry. He also espoused the necessity for members of the guild to be trained in martial combat. The only true way to make a proper suit of armor is to be the one who must wear it. So we get a pretty interesting introduction to the origins of the Knights of the Crucible here in these opening paragraphs. Starts off with the first paragraph, one of the most fascinating and rich histories in all of Eora. It almost sounds like kind of like a book report kind of thing. It's very clearly written by someone who I think is trying to present them in a positive way. But it is interesting to look at where the origins of this are with this person named Olrun Sinhud, who formed a guild. And it's interesting that instead of it being soldiers who moved towards blacksmithing, it was actually blacksmiths who said you also need to learn how to engage in martial combat so that you can understand the impact that your craft actually has, right? There are people who I think can make these objects and these things and these products, but they don't really have an innate nuanced understanding of what their usage actually is. And I think that is something that really sets the Crucible Knights apart. And in real life too, I think we see this. Like if you are, engaging in a product or service with people who have actually engaged with that product or service, or they have used it firsthand, then I find that those people probably will make better products or services as a result of that, because they have that nuanced understanding, especially in the small little ways that really show that you've developed and thought these things through properly. And so right from the beginning of this guild, which was just called the Crucible at the time, there was this emphasis that, like, yes, you are already a skilled blacksmith. That was kind of like the entry point into the guild, but you now also need to be proficient in martial combat. You need to know how it is that your armor and weapons actually work on the battlefield, not just in a theoretical way. You need to get your hand on the hilt, you need to have the armor over your body, and you need to actually go out there and experience this firsthand so that you know the impact of what you're making has. And I personally really like that. And so that kind of base virtue is what leads a lot of the Knights of the Crucible, in theory anyways, as they become the Knights of the Crucible formally. Olrun led the guild for years, instituting a policy that any man who wanted to join must not only be a skilled blacksmith, but also take the time to learn how to hold himself in battle. He added a training ground to their guild hall, and there was scarcely a minute of daylight that didn't see members out in the field owning their fighting technique. Because of this, the guild earned the nickname Knights of the Crucible. They became a de facto militia for the Deerwood, an honorable group that many turned to for help. They were known to be fair, ethical, and quick to respond. So this is just kind of a re-emphasis of something we've already talked about, and we see how the name Knights of the Crucible comes about. You have all these blacksmiths that are getting together, making armor and weapons and whatnot, but they're also engaging in all the daylight hours in martial combat, owning their fighting techniques, and so they are not unlike knights, but they are also of this guild called the Crucible, so they are therefore the Knights of the Crucible. It's really a straightforward name, really, when you think about it. It's just what people would have called them, and they must have adopted that moniker as they went forward. I like to see things like this, especially today. Like I just came back from a public talk, where people were talking about living intentionally and dedicating like every moment of your life and day towards certain things. And it's almost inspiring for me to see people like this, even in a fictional sense, who like are dedicated to their craft as a tradesperson in the forge, but then they also will dedicate every moment they have outside of that to owning their martial skills, because that's part of what it means to be a Knight of the Crucible. As someone who spends a lot of his time on his phone and on Netflix, sometimes I aspire to be a little bit more like that. Not that there's anything wrong with having time on your phone or enjoying something on Netflix. This is more of a personal struggle that you're just personally getting a view into, dear listener. I am not commenting on you in any way, shape, or form. The knights chose Abaddon as their patron, dedicating their works to his name. To honor him, they incorporated his symbol into their own and wore it on their arms. Many of the knights took this honor further, regardless of what material of the suit of armor was made from. Something on the right arm was always made with iron, celebrating Abaddon's moniker, the Iron Arm. Both of these traditions are followed by some of the knights to this day. I really like this detail because it shows something that I have liked about good writing in video games, and something that I have seen Obsidian do multiple times, is this one little detail here about, Abaddon, which is god of the forge and god of blacksmithing and hard work and trades and skills, etc., etc. Abaddon is also called the Iron Arm, and so these Knights of the Crucible, who have adopted Abaddon as their patron deity, they do this thing where they include a little bit of iron in the right arm of the armor that they craft as a way of like worshipping or giving honor or praise or recognition towards Abaddon. And it's like, that's a small detail that a writer wouldn't have to think about, but Obsidian did, and they put it in the game. And I really like that because it adds a little bit of reality and liveliness to it. The knights' smithing skill led them to be known throughout the land as the premier artisans of their craft, leading people to call them any item of exquisite quality of the Crucible. So, if you had a sword that was really high quality, people would say, oh man, that's of the Crucible. They would just, their name went hand in hand with high quality. Their training and dedication truly came into play when the War of Defiance, locally known as Hadrit's Rebellion, Olrun, knowing the importance of winning the war, sent out a call. All able-bodied knights were to join the militia. They quickly proved invaluable to the cause and helped turn the tide of the rebellion. And this was particularly true in the Battle of Defiance Bay. Admeth had already been lost in a previous battle, and the morale for the Deerwood militia was failing. With the help of the Glonfathan astrologers, the knights were able to rout the Imperial forces and secure victory for Deerwood. The new Duke, grateful for the help, and knowing that without the knights the Deerwood would never have survived, made a decree. The knights would thenceforth be welcomed into the Duke's castle and become his official royal guard. In recent years, the Crucible aspect has fallen by the wayside in favor of knight. The requirement that members be proficient in both smithing and martial combat has loosened to the point that anyone who applies is guaranteed entrance, even if they possess little or no smithing experience. This is an allegation that is vehemently denied by the knight. Thus concludes the reading of The Blacksmith Knights, a short history of the Knights of the Crucible. But there's a bit we should go over in case you're not familiar with some of the local history of the Deerwood. So we said earlier that the Knights of the Crucible became a de facto militia for the Deerwood, and that many turned to them for help because they were honorable, and they were known to be fair, ethical, and quick to respond. And so when the War for Independence, often known as the War of Defiance, happened within the Deerwood, it's not too much a surprise that the Knights of the Crucible stepped up to the plate. It says here that Olrun, knowing the importance of winning this war, sent out a call. All able-bodied knights were to join the militia. And so, really, they became one of the militaries that were fighting in favor of Deerwood gaining its independence, because the Deerwood was a colony set up by the Empire of Adir from across the ocean. Adir had sent out explorers a long time prior to this, and they found this new continent, this new world, as you will, which they called the Eastern Reach, and they set up the colony of Deerwood there in their name. But as there were some tensions that grew between this colony of the Deerwood and their mother empire of the Adir Empire, which is where your character from Avowed is from, by the way, they culminated into a war called the War of Defiance, which is why the city of Defiance Bay is actually called Defiance Bay. Prior to that, I believe it was referred to as New Dunreed or something of that nature, but it is renamed as Defiance Bay after they won the war. And there's a nice little detail that they include here about the Knights of the Crucible being very helpful in the wake of one key person being lost in battle, and that was Admeth Hadrit, who is kind of the leader of the entirety of the Deerwood at the time, and he had been lost in battle, so morale was at an all-time low. But the Knights of the Crucible were trying to keep that fire going, keep everyone fighting for the cause. And with the help of Glonfathan astrologers, they were able to successfully do that. Now, the Glonfathans, if you're not aware, perhaps you've only played Avowed, so you wouldn't have known about them very much. The Glonfathans were the people that were already living on the Eastern Reach continent. As I said, this was the new world that the Aedir Empire and other worldwide empires had found as well, and so they had set up colonies on the Eastern Reach. Well, there were already people technically living here. They were like the native tribes of people who lived on the Eastern Reach, and those would be the Glonfathan tribes, otherwise known as the Nation of Air Glonfath. And there's a lot of really troubled and turbid history between the colony of the Deerwood and the Glonfathan people, but they had united at some point with a relative semblance of peace between the two nations, and ultimately I think they recognized the Aediran Empire as more of an enemy to them both than anyone else. And so they had this peace between each other, and they were actually able to work together. Glonfathan astrologers, which is what they sound like, they were actually very adept at mathematics and understanding of the cosmos and whatnot, helped the Deerwooden armies defeat the Aediran armies, the imperial armies from across the ocean. How did a bunch of astrologers help with that? You might wonder. Did they recognize that some of the zodiac signs of the Aedirans were a bunch of Pisces or whatever? No, that's not what they happened. In Aora, there are two moons. There's the big moon and then there's the tiny moon. The names escape me at the moment, but regardless. When these two moons coalesce in their orbit, they cause something called a lover's tide, which is like a very extreme version of a tide. You can almost imagine it causing a tsunami or something, and it can lead to a lot of destruction. And in fact, there are a lot of bookmarked endings and beginnings within the history of Aora that are noted by when lover's tides came and caused great destruction in certain areas. I remember reading elsewhere within the lore for this game, in this world that we're talking about, that in the War of Defiance, a lover's tide occurred that the Deerwooden armies were able to use as an advantage against the Aedirans, and so they were both fighting the Deerwooden armies and they were fighting against this lover's tide. So it seems that the Glonfathan astrologers saw this event coming, and they let the Deerwooden armies, particularly the Knights of the Crucible, let them know ahead of time, like, hey, just so you know, a lover's tide is going to be happening around such and such a time. And they use that strategy to be able to defeat the Imperial forces, and that is actually what secured victory for the Deerwood. That pivotal moment in the war was the deciding moment that gave them their independence, which they won as a result. Now, because the Knights of the Crucible were so instrumental to winning the War of Defiance and securing the Deerwood its own independence as its own bona fide nation, they obviously got a new status recognition as a result. And they are now the official royal guard in the city of Defiance Bay. And this is a large reason why you see almost exclusively most of the Knights of the Crucible in Defiance Bay. And you can see them wandering around everywhere throughout the city because they are now the official guard. It's not the dozens who also fought alongside in the war, and it's not the House of Dominel who have all their fingers and in the underbellies everywhere and are actually secretly running a lot of things. It's the Knights of the Crucible because of their heroic and noble deeds within the war that gained them independence. It makes a lot of sense. Now, it closes off this part of the book here that's saying, in recent years, the Crucible aspect has fallen by the wayside, which is that they have not required people to be very good soldiers and also very good blacksmiths. You can be one or the other. And there is not really a huge focus on people having to be great blacksmiths anymore. And I think that something goes hand in hand with the fact that the War of Defiance, the people who get a lot of the glory are the soldiers on the field, right? Like, that's what you think of when you think of war. Even though we know, obviously, just, thinking about it objectively, that the people at the forges making the weapons are also instrumental forces for the war. But, that's just not in the limelight. And perhaps that is part of the reason as to why, is people saw what the Knights of the Crucible were doing, and there was an overwhelming amount of people that wanted to join, but this strict, you also have to be a skilled blacksmith aspect was making them reject a lot of people. And I imagine with their increase in responsibility of being a royal guard, because they're also stationed at a place called Fleetbreaker Castle, right? Like, they're not just in this one area, they are stretched across the Deerwood. I imagine that they want to have an increase in their numbers. Like, we need more men and women in the Knights of the Crucible if we're going to do an effective job of our mission across this entire place, especially now that we're considered the official royal guard. We have a name to live up to. So perhaps that's a good rationale for why the blacksmithing side of things became less important. Of course, with the blacksmithing being kind of the foundational value and virtue that Olrune started the guild with in the first place, they're a little bit resistant to admitting that or even letting that kind of idea run rampant. Personally speaking, I think it should be okay for, these kind of groups to be able to change and evolve as their scope of practice or responsibility does. Then a group needs to change. So I don't personally see it as a problem, but there is obviously going to be problems that come out of it, especially people who are diehard purists, if you will, in the sense that, no, this is what the Knights were formed off of. We wouldn't be the effective Knights of the Crucible that won the War of Defiance in the first place if we didn't stick to these virtues, and so they are important. And there is credibility in that statement, that is the thing that separates us from other groups of the likewise, such as the Dozens, for example. This is what sets us apart. So if we don't stick to this foundation, then we are not the person or group that we are now. And I've never really known where I fall on that, because now that I'm talking out loud, I'm kind of changing my own mind, as it were. So I don't know, if anyone listening to this, what do you think? Is that really a big deal, or is it not? Send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com. Now, while recording, it has come to my attention that there are some things I have to attend to today, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get to the second half of what I wanted to talk about in today's episode. Hopefully, I can record some more later this week and have something out for you on the 23rd, but if not, then this is what we will have, so there you go. But if I don't end up talking about it, I do have 2 more books in the game I want to kind of go through, and that has to do with the ranks within the Crucible Knights. So if I don't get to finishing this segment, sorry about that. I will finish recording it and get it out either next week or the week after. But for now, let's actually get with closing the episode out.
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
So we've been talking about the Knights of the Crucible, which is, for me, hasn't actually been that interesting of a faction. They're kind of like, oh yes, they're the heroic knights who do the noble thing and blah, 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 blah. I never really found them that interesting. The most interesting group of the 3 in Defiance Bay for me was House Dominel, but I always play as a pretty, chaotic good character, if you will, so I never really aligned with them. So I did end up siding with the Knights of the Crucible, but it's been very interesting diving into not just the history of the Knights, but also asking that question of how much does the foundational virtues of a group of people matter? Because if you're an individual and you live by certain virtues, or you have certain priorities in life, and you discover that maybe those are out of whack and you should change them, I think anyone would agree that you should change those things if you discover or realize that there is something that maybe is more important. But when it comes to a group of individuals that have formed some level of an institution, how okay is it to change those foundations? Because if the group discovers that, hey, you know what, we don't actually need to be focused on blacksmithing that much. What's really important is that we have these people in the streets defending the poor or defending those who are facing injustice. That's more what we're actually about. You'd want these institutions to be able to change that about themselves, right? But at the same time, these people would not be here were it not for those foundational virtues in the first place. They would be a completely different group, and who would know if they would actually succeed? So is sticking by those early foundational virtues something that you should never waver on? Interesting question. I don't know the answer to. But as for closing out today's episode, thank you everyone for listening. I received some communiques from people on last episode, which was a goodbye episode to Avowed cast. I still haven't heard from Sora yet, which I'm not terribly surprised on. He is very purposely kind of disconnecting to reprioritize some other things in his life, and I wish him well, and I miss him dearly. But regardless, I also am putting out a request for there. If anyone here who listens to the show has also listened to Avowedcast and you have some thoughts on maybe directions that you'd like the rest of the Avowedcast group to go, let us know what kind of podcast you'd be interested in hearing, because we've kind of decided that we are going to definitely continue meeting and talking about role-playing games, recording it, and just putting it out there for people to listen to. But obviously, since we're not going to be on the Avowedcast feed, we're going to be starting our own podcast. So any thoughts or feelings or whatever that you might have about that, send them our way, because we're at the early moments in forming this podcast. As it stands, it's going to be fairly casual, where we're just going to be meeting up. We're just going to be talking about RPGs, and we'll probably have some form of a topic at that time for the day, and we're going to really form our identity as we go. We're not putting a lot of pressure on it having to be a certain thing. But if you want to help form that identity, please get involved with by listening to this podcast, because this is primarily where you're going to hear about it until we actually start recording and release our first episode. we're going to have to come up with a name and maybe come up with a little bit of a format, etc., etc. If you want to be involved in that in some way, reach out to me. Let me know, worldofaora@gmail.com. For those who don't know what Avowedcast is, it was a community-run podcast for the game of Avowed, created by fans for fans, and we mostly just talked about RPG mechanics and tropes, etc., etc., and then you kind of put it within the context of Avowed. The majority of the podcast's life was when Avowed was being in development and not released. So yeah, if anyone's interested, that's how you can reach out. If you enjoyed today's episode, send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com, and let me know. And if you didn't enjoy today's episode, do likewise and let me know, because it helps me to get better, and it also still opens up opportunity for conversation. And I love talking with you guys. If you would like to support the show, you can do so at ko-fi.com/worldofaora. That's ko-fi.com/worldofaora if you want to support the show by tossing $5 here or there. And on that note, I do have a bit of an announcement. I have I've gotten enough funds, I think, through the Ko-fi account that it would cover a lot of any expenses that this podcast might have. So I'm going to keep a section of this money aside in case anything happens, like if my microphone has wiring issues and I need to replace it, or if something happens with an Audacity update and I can never use Audacity, and so I have to pay for an actual program. That's what the money in that PayPal is for. However, I think I have a decent amount in there, and now that I have that kind of amount, I've been wondering what to do with any excess at this time, and I'm wanting to start giving that away to some form of a charity, whether it be local or what have you. I know Obsidian does stuff with children's hospitals or thing like that, and so that's something I'm going to start doing with anyone who starts supporting the show in that way. So if you support the show, I will be giving a lot of that money that's over and above what the show already has towards some form of a local charity. I know in my area there is homeless shelters that really need some help and supplies and things like that, so I might put them towards that. If, however, you want to support the show and you specifically want it to go towards the show and not towards a local charity, or vice versa, you want it to go towards a local charity and you don't want it to ever go towards the show, just make sure you make a note when you support on Ko-fi, and I will make sure that those funds get allocated properly the way that you would like. And that's just kind of a recent thing that I've been thinking about for a while, especially about living intentionally. And so that's something I'm going to try to do a little bit more intentionally now that I'm actually doing it. So there you go. As for what I've been playing lately, it's just been The Outer Worlds 2, which has kind of actually revived me back into video games again. I've really, really been enjoying The Outer Worlds 2. It definitely has some things about it I don't like. I'm not saying it's a perfect game, but overall, I'm very much enjoying it. I think the humor is very well on point, that Obsidian knew what they were kind of going for in terms of vibe and dialogue. I love the different mechanics and the flaws of The Outer World 2. It's been a very fun game to play, and it's been an interesting role-playing experience as well. I do still think that there is something lacking in the exploration side of things. I'll explore every nook and cranny, and very often I will be unrewarded for that time, and I'll just be kind of running back and forth and from one empty space to another. And I think that was something I critiqued in the first game as well, is that it was very cool, and I liked looking at lots of stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm playing a game, and if I spend 5 minutes running around in a field, I should find something in that field, you know what I'm saying? Rather than it just being a set piece because it would be there. But that's just my opinion. Overall, I'm still playing the game. I'm really enjoying how what I'm building on my character feels impactful, and I do genuinely feel like if I replayed the game from a different approach, that it would actually be a very different experience. And this is also the first game where I have very successfully done a stealth build on mouse and keyboard. I don't know why, but I've always found mouse and keyboard very awkward for stealth builds. And I'm not sure why that is, but this one I've been actually able to pull it off with a decent amount of success, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm looking forward to really getting into the companion characters. I know a couple that are coming down the road, and I'm looking forward to getting them. As well as some of the weapons, the unique weapons in the game, are just bonkers cool. There's one that I know of, I haven't got yet, called the Blender, which essentially will use any ammo that you have, so it doesn't matter if you have heavy ammo or long rounds, short rounds, compact rounds, this kind of rounds. It doesn't matter what kind of ammunition you have. This thing will use all of it, and you never have to reload. It's just one big clip. I love that idea for a weapon. Why have I never seen that weapon in another game before, or did I just miss it? I think stuff like that is brilliant, even if it's weird or even if it's overpowered, it's just fun. And I think giving fun to players is something that a lot of games haven't not always, but like, I don't know. I have felt for a long time that a lot of games focus on either being very different or being very the same, that a lot of games haven't thought what's necessarily fun. Obviously, I'm not saying universally, obviously there are a lot of standout things that are different, and what is fun for one person is maybe not fun for another. But in terms of just capital F fun, like goofy, silly, this is just fun to play, Outer Worlds delivers, and I really appreciate that. Outside of that, I have been spending all of my free time playing the game of Cairn, or I guess more specifically, writing adventures and quests for the game of Cairn, as well as Eco-Mofos, which is based on the same system as Cairn, but it's more of a Weird Hope punk mid-future role-playing game. Weird Hope is like directly contrasted against Grimdark. Not that there's anything wrong with Grimdark, but yeah. So I've really been enjoying Weird Hope, Eco-Mofos, and they actually right now have a Kickstarter on BackerKit. I was like, that's saying like I have tissues for Kleenex or something. Anyways, they have a fundraising campaign on BackerKit called Islands of Weird Hope, where the Eco-Mofos game is going to out into the wild ocean and sailing on the seas. And there's going to be kaiju and mecha and islands and a whole bunch of really awesome stuff, ship battles and all these different mechanics are going to be involved. And it just kind of evolves the game into this new area. And I'm 100% sold on it. I am on the Discord all the time, very active on there. Love that community. And it's been fun writing stuff for that. And I like Cairn and Eco-Mofos because they're very accessible to write for. And I especially like Cairn because it's also financially accessible. Eco-Mofos probably is as well, but being in Canada, I have to ship stuff to me, which costs a lot. But hey, that is what it is. I love the game regardless. So yeah, if you're into RPGs and you like a really supportive, cool community, I highly suggest checking either of those out. And you can find me in the Eco-Mofos Discord just going ham there and being kind of obnoxious and irritating, really. But regardless, that's me. What have you been playing? Send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com. Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode about the Knights of the Crucible. I hope to talk more about them in an upcoming episode, a little bit about ranks and the nuances of who they are. But for now, I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.